Shalom from Israel, I'm Ariel Ben Aram. This week we read Parashat Bo. It's interesting because the semantics, the way the Torah narrates the first verse of this portion is interesting. It said, the Lord said to Moses, "Come to Paro." Now it's interesting because they reflect a lot in the semantics of it. So why come to Paro? So it's like the idea is some kind of just go to Paro, but not come to Paro. So they reflect why it had to be this way. He could have said to Moses, "Moses, go to Paro and tell him so and so." But no, come to Paro. So our mystic sages debate about this. Not mystic and non-mystic also. They say, well, what is the story behind the body, the come to? They give several reasons. The main of them is that Moses was afraid of Pharaoh. Now, why he was afraid of Pharaoh if he spoke to Pharaoh several times before? He actually grew up in Pharaoh's house. Let's never forget about that. Moses lived 40 years in Egypt in the house of Pharaoh. He was part of royalty. It's like, why Moses now is afraid of Pharaoh? Now, then our mystic sages enter at this point and says Pharaoh represents, as we have said before, the egocentric approach to ourselves and to life. It's like we really are afraid of ego. I mean, yeah, we deal with ego all the time, but there's a point in which, when there's a final confrontation with this driving force in ourselves, we're afraid. So it's like we have like a split kind of personality. Like this ego within us, as well as there is emotions, passions, feelings, thoughts, as we have mentioned before, as part of our consciousness. But ego has a particular status. It's some kind of king. Ego, as we have said before, is the drive force that tells us you are your own God. I mean, we are God, as we have said before, of our own lives. We rule in our consciousness. So it's like there's no room for any other God but me in my life. That's the voice of ego speaking. It's a kind of truth. But at the same time, if we really analyze that we have a body that literally doesn't belong to us, it's pretty evident. There's a point in which the body acts and reacts in particular ways that we cannot control. So it's like watching over our instincts, for instance, or our unconscious reactions to certain situations and circumstances. We know that we are not in control of our body. We have to eat. We have to take care of our physiological needs, which are beyond our control. We know that. So it's like stop thinking about, I'm in control of my body. When we get sickness, we are not in control. Body gets sick. We cannot do anything about that except for getting medicine and heal it. Now, talking about the emotions, our feelings, a whole different story. And our passions. Those we really have control. So we have to pay attention to that. We have control over what we discern, what we think. So we have to make a distinction. So in this case, ego is part of our consciousness that tends to be in control of everything. Yeah, it is part of us, but at the same time, it's not part of us. As we have said before, ego as well as the rest, the remaining facets and dimensions of our consciousness are vessels. Our vessel is a vehicle. So we have to know what kind of approach or what kind of way we're going to drive that vehicle. So imagine that we are in a car in which we don't have any control. We lost the brakes and the kind of things like. So we can see it in that way. We can use that metaphor. But then there's a way in which we have, we can be in control. And a good asset in that control is being a mechanic. So being a driver is not enough. We have to know how the vehicle works, in case that it doesn't work in the way we want it to work. It's common sense stuff here. So as we said, the only reason that Moses had to fear Pharaoh is like, this guy has some kind of power over me. Usually that's what we are afraid of. Things that we cannot have control on or over. When we see a wild beast, we are afraid. We just move away. We cannot control it. That kind of fear Moses experienced, according to our sages and oral tradition. So it's this kind of quality that Moses is afraid of. So in other words, he was hanging out with Pharaoh for 40 years. There's no fear. But at this point, there is fear. So what is the difference between before and now? Let's say that it was ego as its utmost quality, expression. It's like, yeah, we know that there's ego, but disappointing ego roars. It's like, ooh, I'm afraid. But yet, it's part of us. So it's like sometimes, it's a Shakespeare line in Macbeth. The Kent or Macduff to Kent says something like, there are times in which we are traitors of ourselves without knowing it. It's pretty interesting. Indeed, there are times, excuse me, in which we betray ourselves. And we're afraid of that. We're afraid of that moment, that quality, that possibility. And it's within us, by the way. There is no outer agent that causes this fear. So, we're talking about ego at its extreme. It can kill us if we get closer. I mean, if we are against its will, it can destroy us. It's like it's a power that is bigger than us. It is interesting because talking about powers that are bigger or greater than us, we Jews say a blessing before going to speak to God standing in the Amidah every day. And we say something like, paraphrasing, because God saved Jacob, our father, from a power bigger than him. Blessed are you, Lord, who saved, who redeemed Israel. So Jacob and Israel are the same, as we know. So there are moments in which the powers, the things that are bigger, that are more powerful than us. Hence, we have to ask for God's help to deliver us. So indeed, there is a bigger power. Obviously, I mean, we read it, we know that. We have to find out what is that power that is bigger than us, within us. Then we ask God. We say, God, I cannot face this alone. It's bigger than me. I cannot handle this. Then our sages explain the semantics of the word come to Paro. It's like, come with me to Paro. That's the meaning. So it's like we need God's love to empower our love in order to overcome ego's fantasies and illusions. That's the idea, represented by Paro and Egypt. So we really need God. We need Him. Either we wanted to accept it or not. Because there are things that are bigger than us, and He created those things that are bigger than us for us to learn from our limitations. To learn that ego has limits, that our pride and our selfishness and our greed and our lust and our envy and our coveting have limits. So we have to say, hey, this is the line. I cannot trespass from here. Some people say that our freedom ends where the freedom of others begins. So it's like my freedom is up to here, some kind of 1 meter around me is my space. But others have the same borders. So we respect them. We don't trespass. So we have to learn from that. So it's like the limitations. And it's interesting because we said before, Mizraim, Egypt, means constraints, limitations. Ruled by egos. So when ego is ruling, there are limitations. We're limited by our envy, jealousy, hatred, indifference, indolence. Those things limit us. They do. Our wrath, our pride. Immediately we establish separation. I'm better than you. That's it. End of the story. We're isolated immediately. So then we have to be aware of the negative emotions and the negative trends in consciousness that separate us from our true essence and identity, which is love, as an extension of God's love, from whom and from where we came, everything came. We have to emphasize this over and over. So the idea of this portion is to tell us that first, God is in charge. So we read, the Lord said to Moses, come to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, in order that I may place these signs of mine, says God, in his midst, in Pharaoh's domains. So it's interesting because we have to explain what is meaning hardening Pharaoh's heart. Our sages really pay attention to this portion very, very, very well. I mean, like as in every other portion of the Torah, but this one in particular is intricate. We have to pay attention. So it's like, what is hardening somebody's heart? They translate hardening of the heart as losing free will. When we lose free will, we cannot basically distinguish between good and evil, between right and wrong, false and true, correct, incorrect, useless, productive, etc. So we have to be careful to lose our free will. How we lose our free will? When we get trapped in ego's fantasies and illusions, such as addictions, obsessions, attachments. We are basically captive of them. We cannot move free without them. So we have to go walk in the street with the burden or the chains, whatever you want to call it, or the jail, or the bars of our envy, our greed, our lust, or jealousy. All the negative aspects of consciousness are the ones that limit, that constrain, that restricts our freedom. Therefore, we cannot be free. That's exactly why God said, I'm gonna free you from Misraim, from the restraints, from the constrictions, from the limitations of an egocentric approach to life. That's the inner meaning. That's the meaning that we have to incorporate, so to speak, in our consciousness, to assimilate, to integrate. Yes, there was an oppression. Obviously, it was the most abject slavery that ever have existed, according to our Jewish history. It was the worst kind of exile and slavery. Egypt, as we have said in the blog, in our commentaries, according to oral tradition, was the most depraved society of its time. It was pretty bad to live in Egypt. Very, very bad. And as we said before, and in this portion is going to be mentioned, the plague of darkness, in the plague of darkness, under the plague of darkness, 80% of the Jewish people perished, died. We will talk about that later. So, there was a point in which Paro said to Ego, hey, you, Ego, this driving force, this Paro, say, look, I created you, says God. You have to do according to God's will, not your will. Especially if you are negative, which are not God's ways, obviously. These are not God's ways whatsoever. So he's against those ways. So God is telling Paro, is telling Ego, we have to make goodness prevail. God is good, therefore we came for goodness. Goodness is destined to prevail in our lives and in our consciousness. That's the whole point of the Messianic era, the final redemption, where goodness will prevail. And evil and wickedness and darkness are going to be completely removed from the face of the earth, meaning from our consciousness also. So there's a process here. There is a learning process. We have to experience the negativity of the restrictions, the constriction, the limitations of ego's fantasies and illusions, negative fantasies and illusions. In order to cry out to God, it's like, God, free us from, deliver. This is bigger than us. We cannot get rid of these things. We are enslaved. You are captive in this garbage. And our lives are lived in that predicament. What's the meaning of life? Living like this, like slaves of the most abject kind of slavery. Because actually it's a challenge to God. It's like, if you created us out of your goodness, why there's so much evil and wickedness around? Why are we trapped in this? Because God has an answer. Of course. It's like, hey, I gave you free will. You're choosing the wrong. You're making the wrong choices, which are bigger than you. See, you are not aware of the consequences of the negative choices you made with your envy, with your lust, with your coveting, with your greed, with your false belief or feeling of lack. And we cry out for help. Yeah. It's like, we're not blaming God. It's like, it's our mistake. Please get us out of here. And God says, yes, I will. And that's exactly what He's doing. Delivering us from Egypt, from the constrictions of the negative trends and tendencies in consciousness, represented by Pharaoh and his servants. So, it's like God is telling, I'm in control. The guys, the people who choose to be negative, that's their choice. They're gonna die in their choice, by their choice. Not as a punishment of God, but as a direct consequence of the choices that they're making. It's very obvious. So there is nothing to blame on God or anything like that, or ever. We have discussed this before. So we keep reading. The second verse is say, and in order that you tell into the ears of your son and your son's son. In other words, the idea, God is telling us, this is that I'm teaching you. This is what I'm doing for you. You have to remember every day, as we do twice a day in our prayers, in the morning and in the evening. We have to remember that He delivered us from Egypt, a power bigger than us. And that you tell of my signs, says God, that I placed in them, in the Egyptians. And you will know that I am the Lord. It's like God created His creation. He's the owner of His creation. He acts according to what He wants. That is the big challenge that ego faces. It's like we don't accept that. Really, let's be honest. Like, God is in control of me because He created me. No, I'm in control of myself. I don't want anybody to control me. Not even God. It's like, is that so? It's like, as we mentioned the metaphor of the robot before, the android. Like when the android comes and says, I don't follow your program anymore. I want to do whatever I want. Of course, we are not androids. This is it's just the idea, just to get the idea. But we're supposed to act accordingly. And He's giving us the choice of living in the goodness, in the blessing of life, not the curse and death. So we have to be smart enough to put aside all the negative trends and tendencies in consciousness, because they really damage our existence, our life. The goodness, what we all want. Even the most wicked people, they want goodness. They need to eat. They need shelter. Eventually somebody has to take care of them if they get sick. So it's like, what is the point of being wicked and evil? Ultimately, we need the goodness to survive anyways. Anyway, not everybody, of course, that's why we're doing this, that's why we're trying to give this is not a different perception or view or approach. This is the approach. The Torah is telling us clearly what to do. It's like we have to act common sense. It's plain common sense. Okay, let's continue. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and said to him, so said the Lord, the God of the Hebrews. We're talking about a particular God here. We're not talking about the God of the nations or the God of Egypt or anything like that. We're talking about the one and only God, who is the God of the Hebrews. So we have to make a distinction here. And the Torah is making the distinction. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Humbleness is about following the goodness in life. What makes us humble when we go out in the street and talk to people is the goodness that we do in what we say and what we do. That's being humble. The opposite of humble is I'm going to do whatever I want and I'm going to do goodness, I'm going to do my own agenda at the expense of other people's lives, emotions, whatever, thoughts, well-being. Then we have a problem. Then we're not humble. Pride separates us. I'm better than you. And the separation begins. That's not being humble. Or to impose our will on other people's will. Do it my way. Hello, control freaks. So that, what's the point behind all this? What is ego's agenda? What is I have to be in control? What is it? What is the purpose of controlling and exploiting others? What's the point? Without, obviously, a common agreement, because, we find that in the army, there are levels, we have to obey orders and that kind of thing, but there's a purpose, there's a plan. So this obeying has a purpose. It's not to humiliate anybody, it's just to fulfill a plan. So when there is no plan, when we are not in the army, we have to behave with different rules. We have to be good to each other. Because we're at the same level. There's no generals, there's no lieutenants, captains, colonels, privates. No one-on-one. We're at the same level. So we have to be nice to each other. That's the idea. So we have to be humble. Humbleness is being good. It's not just to bend to each other or anything like that. No, it's just to be good. So to humble ourselves is not just to prostrate, to each other or anything like that. It's just to be good. Do good. That's the whole point. It's like, when he says that you have to be yourself humble before me. So before God means it's like doing his ways. It's like I'm standing before you, be humble. Be good. I'm the good of goodness. I treat you with goodness. You have to be good. You have to be humble. That's it. Let my people go, and they will worship me. What is worshiping? Exactly what we said before. Do God's ways and attributes. That's what's worshiping. We should praise God. It's not just say hallelujah, hallelujah, and yeah, how big, nice and good you are, and that kind of thing. Yeah, those are words. But the real praising and the real worshiping is to do his ways and attributes. We are made out of those ways and attributes. Therefore, we are meant to be those. We came from God's love. We are God's love. Then we have to act accordingly to what love is, as an extension of God's love. Before him. It's like we see a good person, we immediately, to me, it's like there's something good in us that comes up. Because this good person, the goodness of this person inspires us to be good. We act humble. We act in goodness, with goodness. We're not going to, what before a good person, we're not going to behave like, a fool. We have to behave with goodness. And before goodness, what can we expect? We're not going to do. Like we see in a concert hall, people don't speak in a concert hall. There's music, there's people playing, they're communicating something with music. We have to listen, we have to shut up. We are before a concert. And we sit and listen. we act accordingly. Okay. Now, for if you refuse to let them go, behold, tomorrow I'm going to bring locusts into your borders. That's the 8th plague. The plague of the locusts. Again, the idea of the plagues is to tell Pharaoh and the Egyptians and the rest of the world that the Creator can break his own rules. In terms of nature, cause and effect, that's what I'm saying. It's like there's a God, there's something bigger than us who created us, then we have to realize that everything that happens that we cannot control, like a plague, we have to basically humble to that power. We have to be, as we said before, according to his ways and attributes. That's the point. Now, there were 2 more plagues. The plagues of darkness and the plague of the firstborn. Now we're going to concentrate a little bit, as we mentioned earlier, on the plague of darkness. We said that our oral tradition say that 4/5, meaning 80% of the Jewish people died in the plague of darkness. Now we understand how people can die of darkness. In what way? They explain that people couldn't see each other. It was so dark that people didn't see each other. So what is the meaning of not seeing each other? Oh, some people will say, yeah, it was dark. People couldn't see each other. Idiot. Yeah, no. That's not the way we're trying to understand it here. That's obvious. We're talking about the unobvious. How can we die of not seeing each other? We didn't reach out to each other. That's the explanation that our sages teach us about the plague of darkness. Our consciousness was so dark, we were so selfish that we didn't care about the other person next to us. We didn't see them. It's interesting because our sages say that the last 3 plagues affected Israel. The first 7 didn't whatsoever, in any way. But the last 3, they did. Was for everyone. So the locust, the Israelite, they have to care for their food and the cattle and protected it because they were warned beforehand. He said, this one is going to affect us, so let's take care of everything we have because locusts are going to come and going to eat everything. So we have to store the food, we have to store the cattle in a way in which the locusts don't affect us. So thank God nothing happened to us regarding, but it affected us. That's the point. Darkness affected everybody, as we said before. So 80% of the people die out of selfishness. So like, how can people die of selfishness? Well, we're talking about a spiritual death. In the Torah, as well as in all the Hebrew scriptures, death in many ways, in many circumstances of the narration, refers to spiritual death. Meaning we still live physically. We still have a body, we eat and everything. But we are completely separated from God. And that's death in our tradition. That's why we have to be close with God all the time. If we're not close, connected to God all the time, we're dead. So what does it mean to be connected with God all the time? To live by His ways and attributes. Being humble, what it says here. So, then, we already talked about the plague of darkness. Now, the last plague, the plague of the firstborn. That's what we're saying. That it affected us also, our ancestors, the Jews. That's why you have to put a signpost with the blood of a lamb. So the angel of death, we say that the angel of death at that time was God himself. Could protect us, couldn't take our firstborn to death. Now, what is the firstborn? This is something that we wanted to talk about before. We said that there are three main foundations in Israel's identity: priesthood, regency, or royalty or kingship, and birthright. There are three foundations. The birthright, we defined it in our blog. We're going to say it again as the extension, like the reason to exist. That's why we have firstborn. That's why we have children. It's our extension, the extensions of life, the extension of the purpose of life. So Israel is the firstborn. He has a purpose in life. Joseph became the firstborn, then Ephraim became the firstborn, and so on. So there's a clear, what we call the opposite of the negative trends in consciousness is the firstborn. So the firstborn is the goodness that we have to live for, and we have to extend and prolong and continue with our offspring. That's the firstborn. That's why the firstborn of Egypt were killed. Because the negative tendencies in consciousness were going to be removed at that moment. It was so strong, the evil, that it had to be diminished. It wasn't destroyed completely, obviously, because wickedness still exists. But Osei said that in those times, being evil and wicked was probably thousandfold of what we have now. They say that in the previous generations, evil were greater than the evil that we have now. So we say, it's not the evil that we have already enough here now, at this moment in the world. Yeah, but it was worse before. To the point that there was several destructions that God had to do, the flood. It had to be destroyed. It was so evil that it had to be destroyed. So that explains why we haven't been destroyed yet, in our wickedness. This is mild compared to what it was before. But that doesn't mean that it has completely disappeared. It still is heavier in our consciousness. It's bigger than us. We cannot prevail over wickedness. We can't. Otherwise, we would have done it a long time ago. We need God to get us out of this state. And He will. It's called the final redemption. It's called the Messianic era. So the firstborn, as we said, is the extension. Like the extension in terms of the reaching out, the prolongation of the purpose in life. The goodness of life as the purpose of life. That's the firstborn. The priesthood is our connection with God. That's why they have to be tied together. Our awareness of being permanently connected to God, our bond with God. That's the priesthood. That's the temple of Jerusalem. And then we have the regency, the kingship. Kingship is the manifested of all above, of the extension of the goodness of life and our connection with God. Those manifested are the kingship, the royalty, the regency. That's the messianic consciousness. That's the one that is going to be manifest. The one that manifests our connection with God and the purpose of life as the goodness that God wants to prevail in our consciousness and in His entire creation. That's the purpose. So let's be aware of that. So it's interesting because in this parasha, everything happens and we leave. The miracle by God is fulfilled, finally. We leave Egypt. And then we have to cross a sea. The sea has to be split. That's our consciousness. So we have to cross over and leave behind what we don't need anymore, which are the negative trends and tendencies in consciousness, especially the restrictions, the limitations of ego. That's the story of Bo. That's the narration of this parasha. It's one of the most beautiful parasha because it's about our relation. This is the portion of the Exodus. The Parshat Bo is the Exodus portion. It's the living Egypt. It synthesizes our freedom. It's the history of our freedom. So we really cherish this because God is with us. He comes with us to Para, to our consciousness, to our driving force, and say, hey, be good for goodness, for the sake of goodness, for your own sake. Which is your goodness, that's your sake. So, then in this way we finish our commentary. We hope that we have shed some light about all the characters that we have mentioned, that we said before: Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh, and obviously God behind, and not behind, it's present, manifest in our consciousness. What do they represent? What they tell us about ourselves and our essence and true identity and our purpose in life, about what is good and what is wrong, what is evil, the things that we don't need in our consciousness in order to enjoy the goodness of life. We will live in the promised land. That's the opposite of Egypt, the goodness of life. So, of course, there's a process. We have said that slavery, the freedom from slavery, going into the desert 40 years before getting into the promised land, is a learning process. It's a process that we are going to experience in order to enter a very, very special state called the promised land, which is the reason for us to live in this world. So, until then, we will analyze, as we usually do, as much as we can, every aspect of the narration in our history through the desert in every of the next portions, up until we finally are able to transform and trying to redirect the priorities of our lives, which is goodness, which is love's ways and attributes, as the extension, the material manifestation of God's love. So until next week, have a blessed remaining week. Shabbat Shalom. And until next week.